So we have about an hour and 15 minutes left, and about 2.5 hours of stuff. So I'll be not cutting and pasting, but I'll just be skipping through some things, because I figure by the time you guys get to be judges, you're really good at reading, especially tiny print. So I apologize for that part of it. My custody reports are 14-point font, because the judge once said, we need a bigger font. Anyway, hybrid cases is what many of these are. And basically a hybrid case is not one parent causing the problem, it's not abuse, it's not easily defined, and that's where we came up with the term hybrid. But I actually like parent-child contact problems because it explains what it is, and we have to figure out why it is. So as I said before, there are proponents, and I don't want to use names because it doesn't do any good. If they never come into your court, you don't have to hear about it. But just like Gardner talked about parental alienation syndrome back in the 80s, and there were proponents who continue to think that way up until today. It has been largely debunked. The idea that a parent primarily causes children who have parent-child contact problems to resist going to the other parent. It does happen. And we're going to try and sort out when it does, when it doesn't, and those kinds of things. But it's the binary thinking that I'm very concerned about. And what I've done talked about is what I believe and what many others believe. I submitted, I think, a couple of articles. I know the author very well, Ben Garber, who's, I think, done a wonderful job of writing about what he calls the chameleon child. And I would assume Tommy is like a chameleon child, that he's kind of quiet and kind of tells mom what he thinks mom wants to hear, dad what he thinks dad wants to hear, custody evaluators what he thinks we want to hear, and then if they get to see you, judges what they think the judge wants to hear. That's what a chameleon child is. And what Sherlock Holmes' article is all about is not to think by binary, but to think of all the different multiple hypotheses that might help us understand just what the heck is going on with this family and this child. So, you've got factor. This is a chart that was first drawn up in 2001 in an article called The Alienated Child. And in that article, I have allergy stuff that goes on when I travel, just so you know. Anyway, you'll hear me doing that a little bit. These kinds of things that are highlighted so far are what Gardner talked about and what some of the binary thinkers today talk about as causing parental alienation. It's primarily about, I think this is there we go, personality or aligned beliefs of the favored parent. And sometimes the nature of the extreme emotions of separation that's problematic. And I don't know if this chart actually printed. I don't think it did. Because I put it in a PDF and then for some reason this is the only chart that doesn't work. So if that was all that we had to think about, it'd be easy. We can sort it out. Is this causing the problem for the child to react the way the child reacts? And if so, well, do something about it. We can talk about those options. But just like the infomercial at 3 in the morning, if you're ever up that late watching TV, but wait, there's more. The more is sometimes a history of intense marital conflict that happens long before they separate. And then maybe intensifies after separation. Without belaboring it, because we don't have time for it, there's research that shows that children who have a high conflict of marriage, who grow up in a high conflict marriage, and then have a high conflict of divorce, are the ones that have the most trouble. The other one that has real bad trouble is the low conflict marriage and the high conflict divorce. It's kind of like the earthquake effect. How did that happen? Where'd they come from? kids really want the high conflict marriage to become a medium or low conflict divorce. That's what kids really want. But that intense marital conflict really creates some of that problems. What else? The child herself. How vulnerable is that child? What's the age of the child? Does she have the temperament of being anxious and insecure? Or is she that Teflon kid that I mentioned earlier? All of that's going to affect the response that the child has when their parents are doing whatever the parents are doing. Then you've got the rejected parent's personality and behaviors that may contribute to the problem. And with that, you've got a side feature called divorce conflict and litigation. So you mentioned a GAL involved in a case like this, right? That brings the child directly into, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I think we need GALs, we need parenting coordinators, we need minors counsel in lots of these cases. But just the very fact of having them, it's what we sometimes refer to as iatrogenic harm. The system, the solution might be causing some of the harm. And if the children are exposed to this conflict and litigation, sometimes that worsens things rather than improves things. The case I'm reading this deposition on right now, and I've got another one today to read on the way home. There's three minors counsel for the 5 kids. Kind of like two, and 1, right? How about the sibling relationships? In this case that I have right now, the 13-year-old wants nothing to do with that. Nothing. And she encourages her younger siblings to do the same. The one closest to her is the most susceptible to that. The other 3, less so. Oh, by the way, child's vulnerability, the middle child's an autistic child. Do you think that might have something to do with some of the reactions he's having? Might not, I don't know. Poor co-parenting. We definitely see that in a lot of these cases. Extended families can get involved. Jan Johnson, back in the 80s, wrote about tribal warfare. And one of the judges going, yeah, really, we see that. Of course we do. I had judges who say they look in the back of the courtroom and they look for the gray hairs, meaning people my age, right? And they say, are these the grandparents that are helping the problem, help solve the problem, or are these the grandparents that are creating more of the problem? So you never know with those gray hairs. So I think, one more. The aligned professionals. Lawyers, therapists, school people, health people. You know, collaterals are really good sources of information when you do a forensic evaluation. And talk to the school and both parents are actively involved and blah, 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 and all is good, and they say a lot of good things about that. And you talk to the pediatrician, and he's got nothing good to say about that. So mom's the only good parent. It's like, huh? How do you choose sides like that? You know, what led to that? So all of these things might contribute to the parent-child contact problems. And then in Garber's article that I gave you, he's got a few others as well. So when kids resist or refuse, this chart kind of gives a lot of information about what that's about. But essentially, the child is trying to avoid anxiety. When I first started studying this in the cases and in the research, looking at the research, by the way, I don't do research. People think I do. I just report on it. I read a lot of it, but I don't do research on these kids. But what we often see is kids are just so overwhelmed by the conflicts, marital conflicts, separation conflicts, that they choose a parent. And it might not matter which one they choose. It might be the one that is just who they're more naturally aligned with. It might be the one who's maybe a little more sensitive to their feelings. It might be the one who they feel needs them the most. It might be the one I could go on until 12 o'clock, so I'm not going to, right? But they choose a side. It's called splitting. And then one parent becomes all good, and the other parent becomes all bad. And that's the problem, is the child choosing a side, feeling the need to choose a side, and then splitting the parents into all good or all bad. And as the child gets more and more upset, the parents tend to become more protective, or think they're becoming more protective. Yeah?
I think it's a very good point about what I call secondary or collateral alienation, like grandparents. There's a little bit more of that than siblings. I'm glad you mentioned that. But the other one, I wondered if the research showed anything with regard to peer sources or peer alienation, like little kids at school saying, I hear your mom and dad's in this divorce and he's such an over, or some of them here in rural areas that come in and request prayer to for one member of the family or the other. And is there anything in the research about the peer pressure or the peer alienation?
That's a great question about whether or not peer influence might contribute to that cycle of behaviors and different kinds of influences. I don't know of it in the research, but I've certainly seen it periodically in a couple of cases. And the cases I've seen it in is where one parent is very religious and the other parent is not. Or maybe was and is different now. And maybe that led to some of the separation. So it could be that peer, and then I've seen where peers, I don't know which comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? Do the kids cling to their peers with whom they're like-minded, and the clinging to their peers causes some of that, or whether the peers might also be influencing some of that. I just don't know, but I don't know of any research to answer your question. That, because the challenge is research is really good in groups, especially when you got large enough groups. Research can help us understand lots and lots of stuff. But translating that lots and lots of stuff from research in this family is very challenging. And that's the other reason we don't want to oversimplify with some heuristic of anchoring and confirmatory bias. Mostly it's usually, I love when I say things like that, it's usually going to be about anchoring and confirmatory bias when those heuristics get involved. And again, those are the heuristics: anchoring, confirmatory bias, things like that. So instead of the binary, we have to think system-wide on that chart, and then all these issues here. But like I said, one of the things to fully understand is how that child is doing in her life. One of the early cases I had, and again, extrapolating from cases is a hard thing to do, but it's examples. And we had these examples. This kid wanted nothing to do with her dad, and it was basically, from the kid's perspective, he was not a very sensitive dad, who didn't understand her, who kind of was harsh toward her. But as I began to explore what she felt, a lot of these kids reject the parents' relatives. She loved her father's relatives. She loved the aunts and uncles and cousins on her father's side and the grandparents on her father's side. She just didn't want to see her father. Involved in a case recently where the two children were sexually abused, it's not questionable, by the dad's nephew from his side of the family. These girls wanted nothing to do with the grandparents on dad's side of the family, not because they didn't like them, but because they would let this now adult come around them, and that would just re-traumatize them. And they felt, well, it's 10 years ago, why should they care? Somebody's not too sensitive about trauma and understanding these things. So you never know, but we want to branch out to thinking from that binary to systems kind of thinking. Another chart from that 2001 article that I'll quickly do. This applies, this chart of a I'm going to come down here and be a continuum here. At this end of the continuum, the child has a really good relationship with both parents. It's fundamentally wonderful. Parents are good, kids are good, all is great. And that's normative in lots of families and lots of divorces. By the way, we don't see those divorces at all. But that's normative for that. You've got this kind of kid, as we move along, the affinity that I talked about, with that's my dad and stuff like that, also very normative in divorce as well as intact families. As you go along, now you've got a child preferring one parent, and they don't really want to see the other parent, but they're kind of ambivalent about seeing the other parent. So kind of they're okay, but they're not okay. That's what I mean by that ambivalence. And then you've got the estrangement where it's realistic, right? But that happens in all families. It's not just in divorce. We tend to think of it with alienation cases as if it's a phenomenon just in divorce. The phenomenon in divorce is the one at the far end. And this is where we had previously a child who prefers contact with both parents, and now they're alienated with one parent, and it's kind of extreme alienation. And again, it might be that binary that the parent is causing almost all of it, if not all of it. But it's usually more of a system thing, like I showed you with the other chart along the way. But this is important to remember because except for the last part of that continuum, it's normative in all families. And the realistic estrangement here, there's a lot of that goes on, and it's only because of divorce that the child can have no contact with the parent. If it weren't for the divorce, the parent would be around the house, and the child would find ways to have no contact with that parent. I've seen that in lots of the families I work with as a therapist prior to, some of the divorce work as well. We've talked about the child vulnerability issues. Parent-child fit. Have you heard that phrase from your forensics at all? What fit is what my needs are as a child are being met by their parents. If I have sensitivities or interests, that the parent or parents kind of align themselves with my interests and my needs and take care of that. They care about my needs. They care about my interests. My Minnesota case, kid loves hockey. But the other parent thinks the kid doesn't like hockey, but doesn't see the kid at hockey, right? So things like that. What's the fit for the parent and the child going along? What about special needs? I've already mentioned that. We've seen a humongous growth in autism over the last 20 years. Whether it's environmental, whether it's because we have more people paying attention to it and diagnosing it, or what? Back when I started in the early 70s, we saw very few of those kids. My wife was an occupational therapist in the schools for many, many years. In the last 10, 12, 15 years of her, before she retired, all she was seeing was autistic kids on the spectrum. What about isolated families? Some of you are in rural areas. Even your cities aren't that big cities, like San Diego or LA or whatever. Family isolation. Oh, and wait, did we have a thing called pandemic going on the last 2 years? Talk about isolation. The case again now with the 5 kids in the 3 minors council and the autistic kid in the middle. They moved from New York to LA right at the beginning of the pandemic. and then we're isolated because of the pandemic. How did that contribute to what's going on today? Now this chart may be a little hard to see. No, I take it back. This chart is very hard to see. You know, I'm colorblind, which is most embarrassing when I'm waiting to use the restroom in the airplane, and I think someone's in there because it looked red to me, but it turned out it was green. Somebody pointed that out. But I sometimes can't see this stuff. So I'll just tell you what's on here. Somebody's got to fix the colors of this. Normal development, you know, we've got the affinity and alignment, I've said. When you've got abuse going on, it may be mild, moderate, severe, right? But until it's more severe, no agency is going to call it child abuse. And that's why I said I'm worried about the people who think that in this binary way, unless it's identified child abuse, it's not happening. But the kid's reactions are part of defining whether it's child abuse. It's abusive, right? And if this dad kind of hits the kid in the back of the head and ignores the kid and doesn't go to her, she's really into dance and doesn't go to any of her dance recitals, maybe she's got a reason to be a little annoyed with dad, independent of this divorce. But what about parenting problems? They go all the way from mild, moderate, to severe. And we need to understand the level of all that. And I'll try and find a way to get this slide for you better where you can see it. And that will be hard. I don't know. I'm going to have to get help. And I know who to call. And it's not Ghostbusters. It'll be probably my daughter to fix this chart. See this one? Science versus everything else. Simple but wrong, and that's where everybody goes. And complex but right. And very few people are going up that path. I am urging us to go into this complex but hopefully right answers along the way. Have you all heard the phrase gatekeeping? Yes? No? Any no's? I'm going to do very briefly then on gatekeeping. You've got a continuum from facilitative gatekeeping, like the gate's open, to restrictive gatekeeping, gate's closed. And that's normative in families. Research was originally done on families with moms, whether or not they wanted their dad to be involved with their babies, with their infants. And the moms that did, it was facilitative gatekeeping. Moms that didn't, it was restrictive gatekeeping. And they definitely found differences in families. As we moved into the divorce world with that research, what they've done is they've broadened it to 5 different kinds of categories. So gatekeeping isn't just whether I want you to have a relationship with your kid, with our kid, or I'm trying to interfere with that relationship. That's one possibility, or one component of gatekeeping. But another one is, how do we communicate? Do I support and encourage communication with the other parent? And I'm talking about my communication with the other parent. Not the child, but mine. Right? Or do I cut off all communication? I don't want anything to do with them. Right? How often do we hear that? So that's a form of gatekeeping. Facilitative or restrictive. Also, you've got help encouraging decision making. Facilitative, I invite you to participate in decisions with the child, about the child. This Minnesota case, how are these parents agreeing or disagreeing about what to do with extracurricular activities? Or even going to the doctor sometimes. Do they talk to each other and invite each other's involvement? Or do they make unilateral decisions? I had a case in Indiana once, was the worst I ever had, where the mom, the day before school started, day after school started, dad found out that mom had enrolled the kids in a new school. When the kids he was supposed to pick up the kids at school. They weren't there. Because mom had enrolled them in another school. Shaking your head. These are real things, right? Oh yeah. Flexible time sharing or rigid adherence to the schedule. The only time I believe in semi-rigid adherence is with a really high conflict parent couple and you've made very, very, very specific orders. And then I believe following orders is more important than flexibility. Except when maybe there's a reason to be flexible, like grandparents are visiting or something. But then why don't you have your grandparents visit on your time instead of her time? You know? I never understood that. So those are all the different ways in which we have to think about gatekeeping, not just I'm encouraging a relationship or I'm discouraging the relationship. But the truth is, very few parents are predominantly one or the other. And most parents have a little bit of yuck in all of this. It's my diagnostic term, by the way. A little bit of yuck.
A lot of yuck.
Or a lot of yuck. But sometimes good. And they try, because humans are messy. And these guys are really messy until we kind of get them on the less messy path. So, but then they got the other problem. What if it's justified restrictive gatekeeping? And then there's good reasons why we might want to limit the other parent's time. If in fact dad had caused the bruising of the elbow, might not be enough to have supervised contact, but mom would certainly have a legitimate reason, a protective reason for that. If in fact dad were still abusing substances like he was at one time and like his girlfriend would want him to do, that she doesn't want to party alone. She's the one I want to strangle, right? And just using that words, it's like we get caught up in the trauma and abuse of all this stuff. But if dad was still doing that, yeah, we'd want to make sure that his time was limited or supervised. And there's a legitimate protective gatekeeper. So when you hear gatekeeping, we have to also hear, is it legitimate and protective, or is it non-legitimate and just wrong? The unjustified restrictive gatekeeping. So again, this is a different chart that shows the same stuff I've talked about. And in an article in Family Court Review by Bill Austin, I think Marcia Klein Pruitt, and I'm not sure who the third author is right this moment, they talked about implications for judges, and actually they talked about implications for judges as in the article, as well as from parenting coordinators, as well as for custody evaluators and for therapists. But these are the ones that they think are important for judges to be paying attention to. So you're going to see restrictive gatekeeping. That's just a given. But we're looking at patterns. I had an evaluator one time I do a lot of expert work critiquing evaluations. And in this one particular case, the evaluator found that mom was a restrictive gatekeeper. It was all based on one incident from 2.5 years earlier. There were many other times where she was being a facilitated gatekeeper, and in fact, dad was causing certain problems that made it hard for her to try and be facilitated. I'm not defending her by any stretch of the imagination. I'm just commenting on the evaluator's job. You need to look at patterns rather than single incidents. Because even bad single incidents are just that. They're bad single incidents. And we want to know what's happening now and what can we predict will happen in the future. That was a relocation case, which is why the evaluator recommended against the relocation. And gatekeeping is a really important factor in relocation cases. Because the parents are going to be apart, farther apart. Whether it's from West Virginia to Pennsylvania, which is kind of close, West Virginia to Texas, which is West Virginia to California, or West Virginia to Australia. Those distances and the length of those distances, gatekeeping becomes more and more and more important the further away they move from the research that we have. So that's where gatekeeping, maybe even more than the alienation cases, is important to understand. in my view. So now we're going to talk about putting it together, and that's what the last 45 minutes is all about. So one of the things Gardner got right in 1985 was he talked about mild, moderate, and severe cases. And with mild cases, you've got some resistance, but the kid goes. And you often see that with kids between the ages of about 7 to 10 or 11. Because they follow court orders, they do what they're told. Developmentally, it makes sense that they're not going to be really resistant. And when they do, I'm looking for where are the problems especially, because that's unusual developmentally. And what do? Well, parent education is hugely successful for that. Get parents into a class where they can understand how their behavior affects their kids. And if they're sensitive parents at all, they get it. Counseling for the kid, maybe for Tommy, maybe some co-parent counseling. Yeah, the first thing I would do, by the way, with Allie and, I told you I have Allie names, the guy I represented, Dad, is get them into some kind of parent education so they know what their behaviors are doing to Tommy. Because that's what good parent education programs are about. And there's some good online programs for that. You can just Google them, online parent education programs, and find them. They're talked about at AFCC conferences all the time. By the way, the next annual conference is the 60th anniversary of AFCC, and it's in Los Angeles next June, beginning of June. I think it will be an amazingly good conference because they're going to pull out all the stops. As long as there's not serious allegations of abuse or gatekeeping, mild cases like that work well with that kind of solution. Medium ones, as you would imagine, need more of a bullet point list, and they need more careful solutions. And we really need, these kids are more ambivalent. They often don't want to go and kind of do, but they don't like it. And they say they don't want to go, but then when they go, they kind of are okay. And I would, by the way, even though we haven't identified yet that Tommy is an alienated kid or a resisting kid, I would suggest that he might be this kind of a kid. If we really got to know Tommy beyond the anxious picking at the elbow and beyond the silence and overwhelmedness, I would think of him as a medium kind of kid. Age, the nature of his parents' conflicts, he's very much at risk for, if nothing else, of becoming one of these medium kids. And he may have a stronger affinity with one parent than the other. I'm going to assume because the film depicts Dad as being relatively insensitive to Tommy, is he might have a little more affinity for Mom. But that's just a guess, if we got to know more. Somebody had a great idea. We should make a 3-part film. One of you fine judges in here. 3-part film. One about Tommy, one about Mom, and one about Dad. And by the way, I know that Darren's exploring the idea of putting it into a full-length movie. But I think it's going to be years away until that can happen. Because COVID just got over there, so it's going to be a while. There we might need lots of more services, interventions, whether it be co-parent counseling, maybe a parenting coordinator, maybe a GAL, or minors counsel. And I know that you all will love this idea, but maybe you want to keep oversight over these cases and bring them back every 3 months and just check in on how they're doing. It's remarkable how much medium conflict families might go a little bit more straight and narrow if they know somebody's watching them, especially someone with a little bit of authority, or that they perceive as having authority. In the medium conflict cases, typically the parents perceive that you have authority. Very different than the extreme cases, where they don't really care, right? But, and the other thing, if the kid knows you're involved, the kid can say to their parent, you know, I don't really want to go to dad's, but the judge says I have to. And they can take it out of their choice and put it on you all. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Because if kids feel that they're in the midst of a loyalty conflict, I'm choosing to go to dad's when I know you want me to be here. That's the crap of the loyalty conflict that they're stuck in. Again, another diagnostic word with yuck. Absolutely, it's better for them to say, the judge made me do it, is making me do it. Or my lawyer is making me do it. Or the GAL is saying I have to go. Somebody to have that authority. And again, with under about 11, that works pretty well. The severe cases are mostly, but not always, with teenagers. Why? Because it fits them developmentally. They don't like to be told what to do by anybody. And you are part of the anybody that fits into that, in that case. So again, we talked about systematic versus dyadic and binary. And you don't need a history lesson on the research, but it's in here if you want to explore it. So we already talked about this. But I bring it back again because most often extreme cases are still this systemic kind of thing. And now this is when my being an expert is so phenomenally helpful. But it depends. And they're mostly hybrid, systemic, except when they're not. How do you sort it out? I don't know a way to sort it out just from argument. I just don't know. I don't think there's any way to sort out the truth based on argument. This poor judge in this 5-child case in California is going to hear testimony from 2 people, and I'm not sure why they can get away with using 2 people to tell the same thing, because judges usually don't like that, but the other side's got 2 experts. The side I've been hired by only has 1 expert, me. And they're going to hear dyadic information. I'm going to say, but wait, there's more. And I don't know what applies in this case, Your Honor. And they're trying to say they do know what applies in this case when they haven't seen the children or the parents or read all the documents. I say that as if they're akin to snake oil salesmen. And like I say, I don't want to disparage people, other experts. I don't. I really, really don't. Many of them are very well-meaning, and they try to do what's good for kids. But after reading this deposition yesterday, constantly appalled. And the lawyer said, so I sent the deposition with all my notes on it back to the lawyers. And one of the lawyers got back to me and said, I don't know, I was hearing, because she didn't take the deposition, she only heard it. I was thinking maybe her brains fell out somewhere along the way. And I just simply responded, that assumes facts, not an evidence, that she had brains to begin with. I mean, the stuff that came out of her mouth was unbelievable. She was absolute that these children were parental alienation in the dyadic form because there had been no finding of abuse. I don't know. But we've got all kinds of parent types that can contribute to the alienation of the child. I want you to think that the child is who is alienated or not. Doesn't mean it has anything to do with just the dyad or the system. child is alienated, we got to figure out why. So if we think about parent types, that helps us understand. Some parents are very challenging and difficult as parents. They're possessive, they're perfectionistic, they're blaming. Oh, I'm talking about to the child, right? Forget the other parent now. Everything the child does is wrong. In that case, they're kind of emotionally cold, distant. I hate to use the word abusive because it's a legal term. It should be kept as a legal term only. And there's a finding of abuse. Instead, these parents just are not very good fit, at the very least, and maybe a problematic parent. And you know what? Sadly, just like with Tommy, sometimes neither one is going to be that good. You put them up on a scale of 1 to 10, and you might have a 3 and a 4 if you're lucky in these families. But some of them uniquely, when you get outside of their co-parental conflict, they're pretty darn good parents, each of them. So just so you know, I define these things I'm telling you about as horizontal or vertical. The horizontal is between the parents. That's a pile of crap for these people, right? That's where the yuck is, between the horizontal between the parents. And some of them, the yuck is this way too. Like that on this chart here, right? It's bullet points. But some of them are loving, wonderful parents. Both of them. If you can get away from the crap to the horizontal. And I always urge understanding as much as we can about both ends of it. Their framing is all about the horizontal usually. Unless they come in talking about an elbow bruise. That's a vertical, right? That's about the parenting. Or unless they say something about substance abuse. Again, that's going to affect parenting. But they're cursing at each other, there are fights. And by the way, this is kind of low-level domestic violence, right? Compared to coercive control and some other much more serious kinds of domestic violence. At least it's portrayed that way. And it's certainly portrayed as a neutrally gendered kind of thing. They both get involved in that, right? That's more typical than the coercive control, one-directional gender thing. The coercive control with physical abuse, one gendered thing, is very real and very problematic when it is real. But we're not talking about domestic violence here today. We're talking about the alienation. And I once said, somewhere along one of my workshops, or have continued to, it's kind of like physics. For every action of domestic violence allegations, there's a reaction of alienation allegations. There's also some very troubling research out there that was done in the 2010 to 15 range that looked at custody evaluators, even ones that were well trained in understanding domestic violence, and they gave much more serious weight, the evaluator did, to the alienation allegations than the domestic violence allegations. And I find that incredibly troubling because of two reasons. One, likely to be biased. And two, who's supposed to weight these things anyway? I don't give weight to the factors I see. That's your job. I identify the factors, I identify the data, I identify my hypotheses, and then what I can understand about those hypotheses. But the weight to give to those factors is in your purview, not mine. And I believe strongly in staying in my lane. And I wish more of my colleagues did. In California, we have a domestic violence statute called 3044. And it is very simple. If a court makes a finding domestic violence, then there's certain rebuttable presumptions of what to do about that. Straightforward, no big deal. You probably have domestic violence in your statute too, whether it's a rebuttable presumption type or not. I don't know if you're in the half that it is or half that it isn't. It doesn't matter. When the court makes a finding, we have an evaluator in LA County who makes the finding for the court. Quoting my 25-year-old nephew when he was 4, wrong, you just don't do that. I can identify all that I have and say, if the court believes X, Y, and Z, I think it's going to be coercive control, blah, blah, blah. And if you think A, B, and C, it looks more like a, situational couples violence, like Tommy's parents might be. And let you guys make the finding. So you can't read it, but I will try. So you abandoned him, you murdered his aunt and uncle, you blew up his sister's planet, you chopped off his hand, now you want to see him, and you think you're a father figure and join you on the dark side? How do you think Luke feels about that? I love that. That one I can't fix. All right. So, what's the ones that are down at that end of the spectrum where they had a really wonderful relationship and now it's like this? I want to understand the actual behaviors and how much are being shared in almost a folie à deux kind of way between favored parent and child. Let's realize something. Contrary to some of the dyadic thinkers out there, alienation in this fashion is very hard to accomplish. It's mostly, trying to think if that's the adverb I want. It's most commonly going to be successful with teenagers. But you might see the markings of it in earlier years. If a child has established previously a healthy, quality relationship and attachment, it's rare that they will become alienated. It can happen, and that's what we have to watch out for. Most cases are mixed, like I said, but some cases are going to be caused by that parent and almost that parent alone. I want you to think about multiple hypotheses. As I said to you earlier, my brain always works in multiple hypotheses. Is it the result of disordered thinking, delusional thinking, paranoia? Is it the result of intentional fabrication of abuse? Is it somebody who identifies with a powerful parent and they get treated well by that powerful parent? Whatever you think of Sigmund Freud and his theories, one of the theories that was right is the concept of identification with the aggressor. That when you got a hostile parent, some kids identify with that parent because they perceive that parent as the powerful one. And they want to be liked by that powerful parent. Because if I don't identify with that parent, and I'm not liked by that parent, I'll get destroyed. That cartoon about Luke and Darth Vader might even fit into that. Yeah. Is it all about fear and anxiety and the child's anticipatory fear, anticipatory anxiety? I think I'll be afraid of going to Dad's house, and then they just get caught up in that extreme anticipatory fear and anxiety. And then the parent-child boundary issues are huge in divorce. Whether you've got kids that are adultified, usually with teens, where these kids are like the best friend. What do adultified kids get brought into doing? These kids get brought in to, while you're at Dad's house, to take this thumb drive. and check on the computer for stuff about our divorce. Have you all seen that? Because I have. Or parentified kid. Well, stick with the adultified for a minute. Letting you get away with whatever you want because I'm your best friend. I'm not a parent anymore. Just, and by the way, teens fall for that crap, right? Because what are they if not narcissistic? Who's going to give me what I want? They are drawn to those parents automatically. So the adultified boundary problem is a real serious problem in these cases sometimes. But that's not just caused by the parent, it's also brought into the system by a child who is vulnerable to that, partly by age and partly by whatever kind of transactional life they've had prior to the divorce. Parentified kids, we've already talked about them, so I'm not going to talk about them again, but what about the infantilized kids? And those are the ones that are being treated like they're a baby. And the kid doesn't really like it, but they can't escape it. And that's another source of some of those kinds of problems. So think not just the dyad, either or, but while you're thinking about the why, think about the why that includes parent-child boundary problems. In his article about Sherlock Holmes, Ben Darwer talks about those kinds of situations in more detail. Now, Barbara Fiedler and colleagues in 2008, she's a Toronto area psychologist, done a lot of research related to this. And the next 2 or 3 slides identify 4, 5. The typical kinds of things that have been seen in behaviors with a favored parent. By the favored parent, and sometimes you get a sense of it's by the child. In and of themselves, 1 or 2 or 3 of these aren't going to matter. I do home visits in my evaluations. I wonder if there's pictures of the other parent. And just because I don't see them doesn't mean they're not there. I routinely ask the kids, so where are the pictures of dad in mom's house? In mom's house. They may not be out, but they may be in a drawer that's right by the kid's bed. Right? They may not be there at all. I don't know. I'm wondering. I'm kind of curious that way. It's my job. So you can see in this group of 5 different slides the kinds of things you hear in court every day. But it's going to be patterns of these things, multiple of these things, that will really ultimately lead to that dyadic kind of thinking of alienation. And by the way, this LA case has elements of this. Mom doing these kinds of things. I'm hired by mom's lawyers, by the way, by disclaimer here. But you could look at the same 5 sets of bullet points, slides of bullet points, and talk about half a dozen or more of the ones that dad has too. And then you talk about the 5 different kids and their different ages and their different, you get my point, right? About how systemic it becomes. So these are typical behaviors by the rejected parent that she found. Okay, only 1 slide there. Maybe I use slightly different font, try to get it all into 1 slide. This is kind of a bad fit, if you will, in these kinds of things. And then there's the child. And Robin Deutsch is a psychologist in Boston area, who I've known for 30 years, wonderful person, and teaches some of this stuff. These are the kinds of things we see in the kids that are commonly with resistance and alienation. The one that I'm really concerned about are the ones on the bottom. No remorse. It's like, I'm not a gardener. I never want to garden. I don't want to garden. My wife and I moved to a condo. I don't have any responsibility for any of those flowers that are there outside. I like to look at it. But do anything with it? Nah, it's not me. But think about a gardener for a minute who gets their thumb stuck to a bush and just has to yank that thorn out of their thumb, right? That's what these kids are doing with their parent. They're like yanking them out, and they have no remorse at all. That lack of remorse, the lack of desire to have a relationship is very concerning. And then the idea of healing, forgiveness, and reconciliation is just absolutely rejected. One of those religious families that I saw one time when this was a big, big issue, I looked at the 14-year-old boy and I said, and by the way, I'm not religious, but I know enough to ask these kinds of things. So help me understand, what does your religion say about forgiveness? And he went in one big discussion with me about that. Cool. Have you thought about, you talked about all these things about why you hate your dad. Have you thought about forgiveness? No. I mean, he literally kind of half froze up. I think I struck a nerve, and that's why. But he stayed in that frame totally. Needless to say, one of my recommendations was to talk with a Christian counselor about forgiveness with his dad, because that might, operative word might, help. But what we want at the end of the day is the exact opposite of what that 18-year-old girl told me. I will never see him again, and no one can make me now. We want healing. We want forgiveness. We want peace. And some kind of relationship. It doesn't have to be 50-50. By the way, that's another misnomer that I read in the deposition. Because obviously, if it's not alienation, if it's to be, I don't remember how she worded it, but the only good solution for families is 50-50. Now, I will bring up my nephew again. Wrong. Because there is no research at all. I don't care who the legislators are to push for this kind of stuff. And I know that's kind of happening here. And not just here, but lots of other places. And there are other people experts, who go and talk to legislators and push this kind of. Do y'all know the Yiddish word mishigas? Few of you do. It's craziness, right? That's what mishigas is. And there are people who push that mishigas. There's no research that supports that. What there is, clearly, is all other things being equal. And that's a big preface, right? All other things being equal. Both parents actively involved in a child's life and experiences, developmentally appropriately for their age, and depending on where they live, those kinds of things. That's valuable. And perhaps one of the best researchers out there in children and what they go through, both in the area of divorce, but also in the area of dependency court, abuse neglect cases. His name is Michael Lamb, and he's British, and he lived in the U.S. for many years and was at the National Institute of Mental Health. And after his wife sadly passed away, he and his boys went back to England. And he's continuing to do his research. And what he would say is that nothing says 50-50. If we're looking at percentages, we're probably talking about at least 30 to 35% distributed well. So is every other weekend good? Probably not for those kind of families. Is every other long weekend plus another overnight every week? Yeah. Does it have to be 50-50? No. Now, do I think 50-50 is great? Certainly I do. Except when it's not. It depends. And it's not, or it depends on what that's all about. is about the fact that families are messy and how they actually, what their logistics are, their abilities as parents are, their ability as co-parents, what's the alignments in terms of who's really sensitive to the kid's needs. All that stuff matters. So in those cases, we probably have a 6 and an 8 parent. Well, maybe you have a little bit more time with the 8, right? Maybe it's, it just makes sense. Maybe one parent is just more available to do the doctor's appointments, to do the homework, to do all the logistical things in the kid's life, to get to the little league games and art classes and drama and dance and everything else, whatever the extracurricular activities are. Sometimes one parent's just better than the other. And why not let the kid live there more of the time when those logistical things need to be done? All right, I got my soapbox, although I am standing up here. But that's what we have to think about with these kinds of cases. Instead of just automatically assuming that we have to go to 50-50, that that's the goal to reach in these kinds of cases. So a few more minutes and I'll take questions. These slides talk about the negative effects of that kind of alienation. You previously had a good relationship, very good relationship, and now it's crap. You might have guilt, you might have self-hatred, you might have the child could come to believe these unfounded abuse allegations, like the 18-year-old I talked about. How about entitlement? If it's a teenager doing this, that's not a good thing. For the child to feel so entitled that he or she can be able to do whatever they want with no remorse, no regrets. And perhaps poor emotional regulation is really the problem there for so much of this, because they can't manage their emotions. And part of childhood, part of attachment, is helping kids to internalize good emotional regulation, to not be dysregulated. Tommy's a dysregulated kid. He's self-harming. He's screaming and needing to be hugged from Tiger Terry, who's not even real. I call that emotional dysregulation. That is a problem. And if it persists, it's a problem in adulthood. So, now we get to interventions, because that's what we all want to do. You've got to make orders. What do you do? So the first intervention I focus on is earlier is always better than later. If you can get these families into something, whether it's the forensic evaluation, whether it's GAL, whether it's counseling, co-parent counseling, you name it, intervention early is almost always going to be better than intervention late. Because if there's one thing that alienation dynamics have that's troublesome for the families, is that the longer it goes on, the more self-reinforcing it becomes. The kind of intervention is going to be the kind based on the facts of your case. Whether there's allegations of abuse, whether it's about conflict, whether it's about terrible co-parenting, whether it's about poor parenting. Try to figure that out and try to get an intervention to help along that way. One thing you may want to pay attention to is AFCC has some guidelines for court-involved therapists. By the way, if you don't know about it, AFCC is the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. And it's a multidisciplinary group of judges, lawyers, mental health people, researchers, and in my opinion, the best organization for family law stuff. You've got hybrid interventions that help. And you might want to have, at the end of the day, a captain of the ship, as it's sometimes called, or a parenting coordinator who oversees the different treatment components. So Tommy's in therapy, mom and dad are in co-parenting therapy, and they're both in anger management, right? Because that's what you ordered. Those are reasonable orders once you know what's happening here, right? That's what I would think. Who's going to pay attention to what's going on? And when you've got these different silos and they're by themselves, kind of like that submarine where you're isolated and you don't know anybody, nobody knows what the other hand is doing, it's not a real good thing in these kinds of cases, because organization of those interventions, the ability for mom's therapist to know some of the things Tommy's finally starting to talk about. Like, I hate it when you talk about Dad and the crappy eggs he serves me. You know, that kind of thing. Or Dad's therapist to know that I hate it when you think you're playing soccer with me all the time and you never do. Just play soccer with me. When he gets his voice, I can imagine those will be some things he says, right? But how will the parent's therapist know that? That's the captain of the ship, if you will, or a parenting coordinator, if you can appoint one, who will talk to those people and coordinate those kinds of communications. And the orders might have to include that the therapist that the parenting coordinator or captain of the ship, if you will have authorization. Parents will have to sign authorizations for that person to be able to talk to all the therapists. And if that captain decides that the therapists need to talk to each other, we'll authorize that as well. And you might want to, even in those situations, decide who has Tommy's privilege. Because you don't want mom to be able to dump the therapist if she gets annoyed, and you don't want Dad to be able to dump the therapist. So sometimes our Minors Council in California serve to just, if nothing else, to hold the privilege for who decides to pick up therapy for Tommy, for a child like Tommy. You've got some possible things of estrangement's the big issue, and again, severe alienation. Maybe, when you've learned everything else, you know what? Those dyadic thinkers are probably right in this case. It all is mom's fault. It all is Dad's fault. What do you do? The dyadic thinkers that are in my case, on the other side, will tell you there's only one solution. And there's actually a lot of stuff written about that one solution. It's called basically taking the kid away from the favorite parent, putting them into a 4-day program with a therapist to help them understand how they got to this point. And then go live with the other parent with no contact for 90 days, typically with the other parent. It is, and it sounds extreme. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you that I like that idea. Except when I do. I have certainly recommended a change of custody at times. But I've never recommended this program because I don't have faith in the research of this program. The people who run it have tremendous faith in the research. And they tell you that it always works. 100%. And again, if you think about the snake oil salesman concept, that's the only place where we're going to get 100% success, right? So I'm not a fan of that, but I have seen it work, and I have seen it not work. What I've seen work more often is intensive interventions. Robin Deutsch, Matt Sullivan, and Peggy Ward. I already heard me mention Robin. She's in Boston. Peggy's in New Hampshire, and Matt's in California, Northern California. They started a summer camp, a week-long summer camp for these screwed up families. And they would have mom, dad, all the siblings come to summer camp. And you know, the camping experience kind of lowered some tension and lowered some emotions lowered some surus, another Yiddish word, that means grief and trouble and all that. And when you get that environment, some families got better. Did they mean that they went to 50-50? Not necessarily. But they got better. Some didn't. One of my colleagues in Australia, her name is Jenny Neo. She goes all over the country. By the way, it's the same size as the U.S., just 25 to 30 million people instead of 350 plus million people. And their middle is actually desert and outback, whereas our middle, I was going to make a bad joke and say the same thing. But I'm from Michigan, so I'm near the middle. Anyway, the idea being that those intensive workshops, you spend basically all of 4 days with everybody together and try and get some healing, reconciliation, forgiveness, and those kinds of concepts, along with parent education, along with child education, to how they got to be this way. Those I find the most promising. Of course, the camp is not operating right now because it really became expensive, and then, of course, the pandemic hit. So, but what they've done is they've trained a lot of other mental health people who are doing some of those intensive interventions in the U.S., kind of like what they would do for a week-long summer camp. So there's a program called not Family Bridges. Family Bridges is the one I just referred to that I'm not in favor of. By the way, Family Bridges is run by a guy who lost his license as a psychologist because of some inappropriate actions according to the licensing board. And he wouldn't have had to lose his license, except he kept fighting and finally the board was done with him and took his license away. So I have problems when programs are run by someone like that, just my nature, to if you're not able to keep your license, maybe you shouldn't be running these programs. But who am I to decide those things? But there's another one called Family Something, I don't remember, and of course I'm blocking on her name, Rebecca Bailey. Usually when I say I'm blocking on a name, I'll remember it. Rebecca Bailey is the person who runs it. You can Transitioning Families is her program. And actually she has a unique feature to hers, because hers is in a ranch. She brings everybody into this ranch, and kids are drawn to the animals, and maybe the parents are drawn to the animals, and horses, and all these other things. So that helps, and that seems to work. So brainstorm these ideas, but I'm not a favor of snake oil salesmen. How to manage our biases, you can read this on your own, but I encourage 2 things on this list more than anything, or 3 things. Curiosity, multiple hypotheses, and avoid oversimplification. Try your best to not be influenced by the framing that goes on. So we don't have time to go back to Tommy, but questions?
Does the therapeutic dynamic change in any way when you have a bona fide psychological parent involved in potential alienation situation? No way like a step parent over a long period of time.
So step-parent issues are a different breed altogether, because they may not even have any rights. And the parents get divorced, the step-parent and the parent get divorced, and now the step-parent is kind of like a thumb, a thorn, they just yank him out.
But if they established psychological parents...
But they've had a psychological relationship for maybe many, many years.
That entitles us to some contact in most recommendations.
And same is true with grandparents. Because you get situations like where a parent dies, and the grandparents are prohibited by the left behind parent from seeing the kids. They are often, Froxel notwithstanding, depending on state law, they often are entitled to some kind of what would then be called visitation. I would still be working for the same kinds of things: healing, forgiveness, and some kind of reconciliation of the adults, because the child usually wants that relationship. That's the odd part about that. The child often wants the relationship, but the parent that's around doesn't. So that's the dynamic that happens there. Again, no real research that I know of, but anecdotally, those are the kinds of things I've seen in the cases I've been involved in, either as an evaluator or as an expert. I think we have time for maybe one more. And you all have my email on the paperwork. And people reach out to me with questions all the time. Well, no, they don't. They sometimes do. When they do, ideally, I respond pretty quickly. But you never know where I am in the world. You never know what I'm in the middle of at any given time. And if it feels like it's important enough to you that you want to know the answer, it should be important enough to you to ask me again. And only consider me a flunky if after twice I don't respond. Okay? I don't take offense to anything, even when I should. So don't hesitate to say, you know, I sent you this email last week, but you didn't respond. And I'm going to go, oh crap, here I go again. I got to get better at responding. And I'll respond. And if I don't, then you can be mad at me. But maybe even try a third time. You'll always succeed.